Susan Gervaise had lived an entire lifetime believing she knew who she was. A wife, a mother, an Australian woman with a simple, ordinary life. But on the day she walked into a government office to apply for a passport, a single question from the clerk shattered everything she thought was true. Where were you born? It was routine, until she gave the answer she'd been told since childhood. And the woman behind the desk frowned. Her file didn't match, her name didn't match, her entire identity, the very foundation of her existence, began to crumble right there, under the humming fluorescent lights. Within days, the truth she could never have imagined came crashing down. She was not who she thought she was. She was not even from Australia. She was a missing child, stolen from her home more than 50 years ago in England. Her real name wasn't the one she'd carried all her life, and somewhere, thousands of miles away, there were brothers and sisters who had been searching for her since the day she vanished. And as the walls of her old life closed in, one haunting thought burned in her mind. If everything I believed about my past was a lie, who am I really? This is not the story of a child snatched in the night by strangers in masks. It's the story of a little girl taken in plain sight, with her parents' permission, and the decades-long deception that made her believe she had been unwanted. What happened to Susan Gervaise is stranger than any crime thriller. And it begins in 1969 with a promise that would destroy an entire family. The summer of 1969 in England should have been like any other for 4-year-old Susan. Her world was small but full. The narrow streets of Pontefract, the comforting routine of home, and the security of her brothers and sisters always nearby. Her parents were working class and often busy, but they loved their children. Still, life was far from easy, and in that era, communities were tight-knit. Neighbors were friends, and families leaned on each other. It was through those familiar circles that Susan's life would take a turn she could never have predicted. One day, a couple the family knew well came to visit. They were charming, friendly, the kind of people who could walk into any room and be welcomed. They told Susan's parents something that sounded like a blessing. "We're going on a holiday to Scotland. Why don't we take Susan with us for a little trip? We'll treat her like our own. She'll see the countryside, the beaches. She'll have fun." For a family with limited means, the idea of their daughter experiencing something exciting and new felt like a gift. And these weren't strangers. They were trusted family friends. So, her parents agreed. They packed her small bag, kissed her goodbye, and watched her leave, believing she'd be home in a week or two with stories about castles and new adventures. But Susan never came back. What her parents didn't know was that the holiday was a lie. Instead of returning her to Pontefract, the couple took Susan out of the country entirely. First to France, then to New Zealand, and eventually to Australia, changing her life, her name, and her very sense of self along the way. Back in England, her parents were frantic. They contacted the police, desperate for answers. But the trail quickly went cold. In the late 60s and early 70s, international communication between police forces was slow, disorganized, and riddled with gaps. A child could simply disappear across a border and become impossible to find. Weeks turned into months, months into years. Susan's family didn't stop looking, but the world moved on around them. The couple who had taken her built an entirely new life for her overseas, one that erased any trace of her true identity. And for little Susan, the questions began early. Why didn't her parents ever come for her? Why did she have to keep moving? Why did she feel like she didn't quite belong anywhere? Each time she asked, she was told the same devastating story. Your mum and dad didn't want you. We took you in because they couldn't be bothered. That lie would shape the way Susan saw herself for decades. It planted a quiet ache in her heart, a feeling that she had been unwanted from the start. But in reality, thousands of miles away, her real family never stopped wishing for the day she'd come back through their door. What Susan couldn't know was that the clock was already ticking, a journey of more than half a century that would one day force her past and present to collide. In Australia, Susan's life looked perfectly ordinary from the outside, but underneath, it was built on lies. She was given a new name, a new birthday, and a new story to tell anyone who asked. She went to school like the other kids, played in the sun, and learned to speak with the accent of the country she now called home. But no matter how normal things seemed, there was always a shadow. She didn't have a birth certificate she could see. She didn't have family photographs from before. And when her classmates talked about their grandparents or cousins, Susan's mind went blank. There were no connections, no roots to reach for. The couple who took her controlled every piece of her world. They told her who she was, where she belonged, and, most importantly, who she should never try to contact. Every time she asked about her parents, they would tell her, "They didn't want you, Susan. We gave you a better life. Be grateful." And she believed it. What else could a child believe when the people raising her sounded so certain? By her teenage years, the confusion had hardened into acceptance. This was her life now. No point asking too many questions. She left school, got work, made friends, and slowly, she started to bury the ache for answers under the everyday grind of growing up. But even in adulthood, the cracks began to show. Simple things, applying for a passport, signing certain forms, became complicated. She was always told, "We'll take care of the paperwork," and she never saw the documents herself. Then came the day that would change everything. Susan was in her 20s when she met the man who would become her husband. They built a life together, raised children of their own, and for the first time, she felt grounded. Her kids gave her a sense of belonging she had never known before. But with motherhood came a flood of questions she could no longer ignore. Who had she inherited her smile from? Did her children have medical histories she should know about? Why did she have no answers? Not even for the simplest family background questions. Her husband noticed too. Whenever official identification was needed, Susan would become anxious, almost defensive. It was as if she was protecting a secret she didn't even fully understand. And then, one seemingly ordinary day, an event occurred that would pull at the loose threads of her past, a request for documents she couldn't produce. It was small, almost insignificant at first, but it was the start of something far bigger. A journey that would force Susan to dig into the past she had been told to forget and uncover the truth about who she really was. The request seemed harmless enough, just a bit of paperwork, but for Susan, it was the crack in the dam. She needed proof of her birth, something official. And for the first time, she decided not to simply let others handle it for her. She wanted to see it with her own eyes. She asked the couple she had grown up calling her parents. She expected a short delay, maybe a rummage through old drawers. Instead, there was hesitation, deflection, avoidance. Something inside her stomach knotted. The excuses didn't add up. "It's somewhere in storage. We lost it years ago. Why are you asking all these questions now?" Susan didn't know it yet, but she was tugging on a string that had been tied in knots for over half a century. It was her husband who finally convinced her, "Let's just get the records ourselves. If everything's fine, then you'll have your answer." So they began the search. What they found wasn't an error. It wasn't a missing form. It was the absence of her entire legal identity. Her name, the one she had been using for decades, didn't exist in any official registry. There was no trace of her being born in Australia, no trace of her birth in Scotland, where she vaguely remembered being as a very small child. Nothing. Susan's mind spun. How could an entire life just not exist on paper? Then came the moment that shattered the fragile reality she'd been living in. Through piecing together fragments of memory and following whispers of old connections, she learned the truth. She hadn't been given up willingly by her parents. She had been taken. At 4 years old, she had been promised a dream, a trip to Disneyland, by a woman she thought was a family friend. Her parents had agreed, believing it would be a short holiday. But the holiday never ended. The woman took her across the world, moving from country to country until eventually settling in Australia, where Susan grew up believing the kidnappers were her real family. It wasn't just a lie, it was a theft of her childhood, her identity, her entire sense of self. And then the part that felt almost impossible to comprehend. Her real family had been looking for her for 53 years. Somewhere on the other side of the world, her brothers and sisters had grown up without her. They had celebrated birthdays, faced hardships, lost loved ones, all the while wondering where their little sister had gone. And now, in her 60s, Susan was standing on the edge of a choice: to confront the people who had stolen her life, or to walk away from the past entirely. But before she could decide, fate stepped in. A message reached her from Scotland, from the family she didn't even remember. It was simple, but it left her shaking as she read it over and over again. "We've found you. You're our Susan. Please come home." The moment Susan stepped off the plane in Scotland, the air felt different. It wasn't just the cold breeze on her skin. It was the weight of 53 years pressing down on her chest. She scanned the crowd, faces blurred together. The airport noise melted into a low hum. And then she saw them. 2 women and a man holding a faded photo of a little girl in pigtails. Her little girl face. The photo slipped from their hands as they ran toward her. Susan froze for a split second. Then everything inside her broke loose. She was in their arms, not as a stranger, not as a long-lost puzzle piece, but as Susan, their sister. They held her like they'd never let go. Their tears soaked into her coat, their voices shaking as they said her name over and over again, as if speaking it might make up for all the years they'd been denied the chance. And Susan, she didn't just cry, she wept from somewhere deep, somewhere that had been locked away since she was a child, being promised a trip that never came. The memories of her stolen life clashed with the faces of the people who had been waiting for her all along. They spent hours together, talking, holding hands, laughing through tears. Susan learned about the parents she barely remembered, the home she once had, the birthdays they celebrated in her absence, and the relentless search they never gave up on. There was anger too. Anger at the woman who took her. Anger at the years she could never get back. But there was something stronger. Love. The kind that outlasts decades, oceans, and lies. Susan would never get back her childhood, but she had found something just as rare: a second chance at family. And as they left the airport together, Susan knew that the little girl who had vanished in 1969 was finally home. If Susan's story has touched you, don't just scroll away. Like this video to keep her courage alive. Share it so more people learn about the power of never giving up. And subscribe for more real-life stories that prove hope can survive anything. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most.